This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 189 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before we get into this week's transactions, I wanted to remind you guys about NumberFire Premium. With award-winning DFS tools, advanced stats, and expert content, Premium has everything you need to dominate across all three major sports. If you're a new user, try it out and get your first month for only $7.95 with promo code CLUTCH. That's promo code CLUTCH. Visit numberfire.com/premium for more details. Sell Eric Ebron. So Eric Ebron has now scored in all but 2 games this year, and he found the end zone 3 times against the Jags on Sunday. So that puts him at 10 total touchdowns on the year, with 9 coming via the air, because he had a rushing touchdown this past weekend, of course. On a targets per touchdown basis, Eric Ebron's scoring on every 7.2 targets. The NFL average this season at tight end is a touchdown on every 17.1 targets. But here's the thing, Eric Ebron's not playing a ton of snaps. With Jack Doyle back from injury over the last 2 weeks, Ebron's been on the field for 38 snaps. Jack Doyle has played 105. Mo Alley Cox has outsnapped Eric Ebron. He's played 48. And meanwhile, Ebron's only seen 6 targets, while Doyle has seen 10 over these 2 games. And according to Pro Football Focus, Eric Ebron has run just 22 routes. Over 10 tight ends ran that many routes in Week 10 alone. What Eric Ebron is doing is not sustainable. Yes, he's seen a lot of red zone volume, but he's also converted 7 of his 8 receptions into touchdowns in the red zone. Only Davante Adams has more red zone scores, and Adams is the only player with decent volume in that area of the field who's converting like Eric Ebron has. Now, the thing is, tight end is an absolute mess, so Ebron does have some season-long appeal. But he's a very obvious touchdown regression candidate, and I would rather have Jack Doyle over Eric Ebron from here on out. Hold Corey Davis. Some people might think that Corey Davis's performance against New England was a fluke, but I'm not one of them. As you guys know, a couple of weeks back, he was a buy on this 15 Transactions podcast. He had seen great peripheral numbers across the first half of the season, but his production just really wasn't there. But a lot of that lack of production had to do with a quarterback injury and poor matchups. Now Davis has seen 10 targets in each of his last 2 games, and Marcus Mariota finally looks healthy. Mariota has posted his 2 best games this season from a yards per attempt standpoint over the last 2 games. And now Corey Davis has a 30.3% target share. That's really, really good. And he really only has one tough matchup left on the schedule when he'll face Jalen Ramsey and the Jags. Maybe the person in your league who has Corey Davis doesn't really want Corey Davis because of what he did across the first half of the season. If that's the case, maybe Corey Davis is more of a buy. But at the very least, if you have Corey Davis yourself, maybe you bought him a couple of weeks ago because of this podcast, you should not be selling him after this performance. His peripherals are too good, Marcus Mariota looks healthy again, and the schedule is a lot easier than what he saw during that front half of the season. Add Josh Reynolds. Cooper Kupp is unfortunately out for the year with an ACL tear, and that means that Josh Reynolds is the next man up. When Kupp missed weeks 7 and 8, Reynolds played about 85% of LA's snaps. But I do think it's important to note that Reynolds didn't run like Cooper Kupp would run. Brandon Cooks and Robert Woods over those 2 games still ran about 20 more routes than Josh Reynolds did. But I do think that Josh Reynolds will be the biggest beneficiary from the injury because the Rams like to run 3 wide receiver sets a lot. And also, I should add, don't sleep on the team's tight ends as streamers moving forward as well. Buy O.J. Howard. In a game where the Buccaneers threw for over 400 passing yards, O.J. Howard had 15 of them. He was targeted just twice. He had 15 yards. But Howard was on the field a lot against Washington. He played over 65% of Tampa Bay's snaps, and according to Pro Football Focus, he ran 31 routes. That's a top 5 number at the tight end position. Over the last 2 weeks, only Austin Hooper and Travis Kelce have run more routes than O.J. Howard. This is just what happens at the tight end position. There's lots of variance. Crazy performances like this one can happen. But in all sincerity, there are very few tight ends that I would rather have over O.J. Howard through the rest of the season. Add Josh Adams. So on Monday, Doug Peterson said that Josh Adams will be getting more carries moving forward in this Eagles offense. And honestly, it makes sense. According to NumberFire's expected points model, Adams has a success rate of over 48% this season. Corey Clements is at 31%, and Wendell Smallwood is at 45%. Now, the three backs essentially split the Eagles' snaps up into thirds on Sunday night, but Adams saw the most carries of the trio, and he was also the most effective, rushing for 47 yards, while Clement and Smallwood combined for 17. So the arrow is definitely pointing up for Josh Adams, and you should be adding him. Buy Cam Newton. On this podcast last week, I talked about Devin Funchess as a cheap buy, and I also talked about how the Carolina Panthers fantasy playoff schedule is really awesome. That still holds true. Maybe I wouldn't be buying Funchess as heavily, but that playoff schedule for the Panthers is awesome. You want a piece of that Carolina Panthers passing attack, and that definitely includes their quarterback, Cam Newton. He's coming off a game where he didn't even throw for 200 passing yards, so that kind of makes him a buy low option. But like I said, the Panthers' schedule next month is absolutely incredible. They'll get the Buccaneers in Week 13, and then they'll face the Browns, Saints, and the Falcons. Tampa Bay, New Orleans, and Atlanta all rank in the bottom 4 in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this year, and Cleveland is completely average. Now, I'm not generally one that likes to spend at quarterback, but I'd be willing to make an exception for Cam Newton. Add Lamar Jackson. So as of this recording, I don't know what's going to happen with Joe Flacco. He has a hip injury, and that could prevent him from playing in Week 11. But it also could prevent him from playing beyond Week 11. But at the same time, Joe Flacco hasn't played very well. It might make more sense for the Ravens to just throw Lamar Jackson under center. But regardless, Jackson becomes a strong quarterback option off your waiver wire if Joe Flacco is out because of his rushing ability. We've already seen Jackson find the field at times for Baltimore this year. He's run the ball 28 times for 139 yards and a score. And in the preseason, he threw 68 pass attempts while running the ball 23 times. He actually finished the 2018 preseason as fantasy football's top quarterback. And I get it, he's not playing second and third stringers anymore. But we know that running quarterbacks are a cheat code in fantasy football. My boy Rich Rebar of Roto World talked about that years ago, and he dubbed it the Konami code. And really, Jackson might be able to succeed, or at least moderately succeed, down the stretch if he's thrown under center. Because on the Ravens' schedule through Week 15 are the Bengals, Raiders, Falcons, Chiefs, and Bucks. That list includes the 4 worst teams against fantasy quarterbacks, and then Oakland, who ranks 10th worst. So Jackson should give you a nice floor each week with his rushing, but given Baltimore's upcoming schedule, there's a nice ceiling there too. Buy Alex Collins. If you guys have been listening to this podcast all year, you know this is the first time I'm saying to buy Alex Collins. Usually it's the opposite. Usually it's selling Collins. And it's because he's in a split backfield, he doesn't see all of the team's goal line work, his target share is under 6%, and he's scored far more touchdowns than he should have based on his yardage totals this season. But I sort of just talked about why I think Alex Collins is a buy. It's because Lamar Jackson's dual threat ability might open things up in the Baltimore run game. And the team's schedule is awesome. Each of the teams that I just talked about are also not so great against opposing running backs in fantasy football. So if Joe Flacco were under center, Collins would be more of a hold. I talked about that last week on the mailbag episode. Collins can perform like an RB2 with Flacco, but that's not saying that much given today's fantasy landscape at the running back position. But with Lamar Jackson, there's upside. There's actual upside with Alex Collins. And like I said, the schedule should help Collins provide a nice floor if things do go south at quarterback. Add John Ross. So without AJ Green in the lineup this past week, John Ross was the wide receiver for Cincinnati that stepped up. He played the second most snaps at the position, and he ran the second most routes. He ran behind Tyler Boyd. Green might be out until December, so that means that John Ross deserves your attention off the waiver wire. He'll be tough to trust against Baltimore in Week 11, but the Bengals have a few plus matchups upcoming where Ross may be able to find your lineup. Sell Derrick Henry. On the season, Derrick Henry has played just 34.2% of Tennessee's snaps. But since the team's Week 8 bye, Henry's snap share has been below 25%. On 30 snaps over the last 2 weeks, he's carried the ball 17 times. Meanwhile, Dion Lewis, his teammate, has been on the field for almost 80% of the Titans' snaps during this period, and he has more than double Henry's rushing volume. The only reason Derrick Henry has been fantasy relevant at all of late is because of his touchdowns. He's scored in each of the Titans' last 3 games, and that includes 2 this past Sunday against New England. You just can't bank on that week in and week out, especially from a back who's playing a clear backup role on his team. Add Anthony Miller. I'm really excited about this one because Anthony Miller was a guy that I liked a lot coming out. Since Week 6, he's led the Chicago Bears in targets. Now, Allen Robinson's been banged up, but even still, that's a positive sign. Now, during this 4-game stretch where no Chicago Bear has more volume than Anthony Miller, no quarterback has thrown it 15-plus air yards more than Mitch Trubisky. And Miller, as a result, is 6th in football in deep ball targets. If this type of usage continues, Miller could be huge for fantasy teams. And that's especially true considering the Bears get the Rams, Packers, and 49ers in the fantasy football playoffs. Those are 3 teams that they should either be able to beat through the air or just accumulate a lot of passing production. So Anthony Miller should absolutely be added off your waiver wire this week. Buy Mitchell Trubisky. Now, I love Anthony Miller, and I like Mitch Trubisky a lot from a fantasy perspective as well. Since that Week 4 game against Tampa Bay, we've really seen Trubisky shine as a fantasy quarterback. He's finished as a top 10 weekly option in 5 of his last 6 starts. And a lot of that has to do with his aggressiveness down the field. From weeks 1 through 3, Trubisky was throwing it deep or 15 plus air yards on 15.4% of his passes. Since then, that number has almost doubled to 30.1%. And Trubisky also always brings it with his legs. He's averaging almost 36 rushing yards per contest, which essentially wipes out a turnover and a half per game. So even if he's interception prone, which he kind of is, it matters a lot less because of his rushing. That's why he's been such a beast in fantasy football. He's heaving it deep and he's also running the ball well. And as I just talked about with Anthony Miller, the Bears' schedule is pretty strong the rest of the way. Week 11 has somewhat of a tough matchup against Minnesota, but that's about it. And 2 of his 3 games during the fantasy playoffs are at home, where he's been a lot better, against teams who can post points in the Rams and the Packers. So in other words, Trubisky can't just be some conservative quarterback against those 2 teams. And he's playing at home. So I think that Mitch Trubisky is a fantastic trade target right now, and he's a target that would be cheaper than Cam Newton, who I mentioned earlier. Add Ricky Seals-Jones. So Kansas City has been pretty friendly against opposing tight ends this year, but even still, Ricky Seals-Jones had 9 of a possible 39 Josh Rosen targets this past Sunday, easily marking a season high from a volume standpoint for RSJ. And he ran 37 routes, which was a top 5 number at the tight end position this week. So against a soft Oakland defense that's surrendering the 4th most fantasy points per game to tight ends, I think RSJ is a pretty decent streaming option here in week 11. Add Dak Prescott. Dak Prescott's first 5 games this year resulted in 4 performances where he ranked outside the top 20 in fantasy scoring and 1 where he finished as QB 17. But over his last 4, he's finished as a top 8 quarterback 3 times. Prescott's passing efficiency has been better over his last 4 games versus those first 5 ones. Across those first 5 contests, he averaged 6.7 yards per attempt. That's risen to 7.5 during his last 4 contests. But there's also his rushing, and more importantly, his rushing touchdown production. He's found the end zone on the ground in 3 of his last 4 games, and while that might seem a little bit unsustainable, Prescott's averaging 1 rush within the opponent's 10-yard line per game during this stretch. He didn't have a single one of those attempts from weeks 1 through 5. So he's running the football closer to the goal line. So not only is Dak's arm looking a lot better, but he's providing more upside with his legs. And that's what makes him a strong streaming choice against Atlanta this week, a team that's allowed a top 15 quarterback performance in each game since week 1. Add the Arizona Cardinals defense. The Raiders have failed to score a touchdown in 3 of their last 4 games. And over their last 5, defenses are averaging 4.2 sacks per game against the Raiders. That means the Cardinals are a very viable streaming option. They're at home, they're 4-point favorites, and there's a low over-under of 41 in this contest. You should be adding the Cardinals this week. This week's 16th transaction that you can't get in the 15 transactions column that's on numberfire.com is to freaking sell Tyler Lockett. Nothing is worse as a numbers-driven analyst than seeing things like Tyler Lockett's 2018 happen. I think he's a good player, don't get me wrong, but he's scored a touchdown in all but 2 games this year while tallying more than 5 targets in just 4 of them. He doesn't have a single 100-yard game. He's basically the opposite of Julio Jones. If someone in your league is willing to buy touchdowns, go ahead and sell Tyler Lockett to them. Oh, and if you want to stash away a running back, you could add Rex Burkhead. He returned to practice last week, and he's actually eligible to return in week 13. He's another complete flyer given the crowded backfield there, but he at least would serve as a high-end handcuff. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. Yes, the podcast is now on Spotify as well. And if you guys could leave me a rating and review on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it. I'm also on Twitter at LateRoundQB. You can hit me up on there if you have any questions for this Friday's mailbag episode. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you later in the week.